kind of talk a little bit about cover crops and some of the unusual things you see. You know, there's a lot of people talking about cover crops and the benefits, and there's some very obvious benefits potentially in weed control and soil health. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data or research on how it's going to affect insect management, but we know there's some risk that are involved. And this little test we're looking at today is a pretty good example of some of the risks that you might run into and some weird things you're going to see. And I think that's almost the take home to start with, is when we start dealing with cover crops, we're going to start seeing some weird things that we need to think about. There's a little weevil in here called the pea leaf weevil, and it feeds on the leaves of the soybean plant, and in fact, if there's enough of them, it'll cause damage to the point where it'll take out stand. Seed treatments work pretty well on them. The scenario where we see this pea weevil is when you're running some kind of legume cover crop like vetch or Austrian peas, and then you plant soybeans. Keep in mind, soybeans are legumes, so you're essentially planting something they like to eat and then following it with something they like to eat. And these pea weevils are down in here, and they're really hard to find. I haven't even been able to find one here today, despite all this damage. And that's because they're doing a lot of their feeding at night, and they also drop to the ground. They're not very big, and they hide when they're disturbed. So it's really kind of hard to pick up on them. You can see this very characteristic kind of sawtooth feeding on the plants around the leaf edges. That's characteristic of them. So this was the next row over to the one we just looked at, and it's got an insecticide seed treatment, in this case imidacloprid. And obviously the leaves look healthier, but you will notice, if you have a discerning eye, there is some leaf feeding from these pea weevils on the outside of these leaves, that characteristic sawtooth. So it doesn't prevent total damage, but in the cases of severe infestations, it's going to be pretty much protective of yield. I don't know how things will turn out in this test. The amount of injury here may not affect yield, but I've had some of my counterparts in other states with this same problem, where the weevils have gotten so bad that it essentially eats the beans to the ground and cuts into their yield 40–50% in extreme cases, and that probably won't happen here in my guesstimate, but we don't know until the test is done. So, you know, this is just one thing where we see issues with insects potentially in cover crops with soybean. A lot of research really needs to be done. When do you burn down the cover crop relative to when you plant the crop? What is the cover crop? Is it is it wheat? Is it a mixture of wheat and vetch, or is it a five-way mix? You know, all that stuff's going to have a potential impact. And then whether or not your insecticide seed treatments are going to add more value in a cover crop or not. My suspicion is they will, because there's just probably going to be more living organisms in here to eat soybean, but we don't have really strong data to support that right now. This nice little show and tell test though, I think.